As night settles in, something subtle begins to change. Not in the body first, but in the way time is held. During the day, time feels demanding. It asks to be managed, divided, respected. Moments are measured by what comes next. There is always another point ahead, another reference, another obligation waiting just beyond the present. But at night, this structure starts to soften. The Stoics were attentive to this shift. They noticed that time itself does not tighten or loosen, the mind does. What changes is not the flow of hours, but the expectation placed upon them. In waking life, the mind treats time as a task. It assumes responsibility for organizing it, correcting it, making sense of it. This effort continues even when the body is no longer moving. Thoughts drift forward, rehearsing what has not yet happened. They drift backward, revisiting what can no longer be altered. The present moment becomes thin, almost invisible, stretched between memory and anticipation. Night quietly interrupts this habit, not by force, not by instruction, but by removing the conditions that keep the timeline active. There is no audience now, no sequence that needs to be followed, no outcome waiting to be improved by further attention. Without these anchors, time begins to lose its sharp edges. Minutes are no longer counted. Hours no longer announce themselves. The Stoics understood that this is not a failure of awareness. It is a return to proportion. Time does not require supervision. It does not need to be reviewed or prepared for. It passes whether it is observed or not. When this is remembered, not intellectually but quietly, the mind stops leaning forward. There is no need to arrive anywhere. Nothing meaningful depends on what comes next. The present is enough to rest inside. And as the demand to manage time fades, rest becomes something that unfolds naturally, without direction, without urgency, without the sense that anything has been left unfinished. As time softens, memory often tries to remain alert. It continues its quiet activity, as if the night were only a pause, not a release. Scenes return without invitation. Conversations replay themselves, slightly altered each time. Moments from the day linger, asking to be understood more clearly, handled more carefully, or placed somewhere safer. The Stoics observed this habit with calm precision. They did not see memory as a problem, but they noticed how easily it becomes a burden when it is treated as unfinished work. Memory by nature is passive. It stores, it preserves. It does not demand interpretation. What creates strain is the mind's assumption that memory must be managed. At night, the events of the day no longer belong to action. They have already settled into the past. Nothing can be corrected there. Nothing requires improvement. And yet, the mind often behaves as if something important will be lost if attention relaxes. The Stoics understood that this fear is misplaced. What truly matters does not disappear when it is not reviewed. What is essential remains without effort. Memory does not need to be guarded. It does not require repetition to stay intact. It carries itself. When this is allowed, memories begin to change their tone. They lose their urgency. They stop asking for response. Images may still appear, but they no longer pull the mind into participation. They pass the way distant lights pass a window, visible but not involving. The night does not erase the past. It simply removes the need to relate to it. There is nothing to extract from what has already occurred. No lesson required in this moment. No conclusion waiting to be reached before rest is permitted. As the grip on memory loosens, the mind finds space. Not empty space, but unoccupied space. A space where time no longer stretches backward, where attention no longer leans into what cannot be changed. In this space, rest does not arrive as an achievement. It appears as a natural state, once memory is allowed to remain what it already is, complete, contained and finished for the night. As memory begins to settle, the mind often turns forward. It scans what has not yet arrived. Plans, expectations, possibilities move quietly into view. Even at rest, the mind tries to arrange what comes next, as if tomorrow depends on this silent rehearsal. The Stoics recognized this tendency clearly. They understood that anticipation is not harmful by itself. It becomes exhausting only when it is carried into moments where action is no longer possible. The future does not exist in the night in the same way it does during the day. There are no decisions to make here, no timing to calculate, no advantage gained by further preparation. And yet, the mind often resists this simplicity. It imagines that loosening its grip on the future means becoming careless or unprepared. But the Stoics saw something different. They saw that clarity comes from timing, not from constant attention. There is a proper moment for thought and response. Night is not that moment. What belongs to the future will meet the mind when the body is ready to act again. It does not need to be summoned early. It does not improve through repetition. As anticipation quiets, the sense of forward motion begins to dissolve. The mind no longer leans ahead of itself. It stops reaching toward outcomes that cannot yet be shaped. This is not avoidance. It is alignment. The Stoics taught that harmony comes from engaging with things when they are present, not before. To think ahead endlessly is not wisdom. It is a misplacement of energy. When the future is allowed to remain untouched, something subtle occurs. The present becomes more spacious. There is no pressure to move beyond it. Nothing needs to be resolved before rest can begin. Nothing essential is being neglected. The night does not ask for readiness. It asks only for presence. And as the expectation to prepare fades, the mind naturally slows, settling into a rhythm where time no longer pulls forward, and rest becomes possible without effort, without rehearsal, without the sense that something important is waiting just ahead. When memory has softened and anticipation has stepped aside, the present often remains under subtle pressure. The mind may stop traveling backward or forward, yet it still tries to stay alert. It watches the moment closely, as if presence itself were something that could be lost without effort. The Stoics noticed this as well. They understood that even awareness can become strained when it is treated as a task. Presence does not require maintenance. It is not something that must be stabilized, secured, or continuously reinforced. The present moment exists on its own, without assistance. During the day, attention is often used deliberately. It is sharpened for decision, response, and direction. But night removes the conditions that require this kind of focus. There is nothing here that benefits from being held tightly. No moment that improves through vigilance. When the mind stops trying to remain present, something gentle occurs. Awareness spreads rather than concentrates. It no longer fixes itself on any point in particular. The Stoics understood this as a return to natural order. The mind, when not directed, does not disappear. It settles. This settling is often mistaken for dullness or loss of clarity, but it is neither. It is a shift from active attention to passive awareness. In this state, the present is not experienced as a narrow point. It becomes wide, unmeasured, and forgiving. Time is no longer something to stand inside of. There is no need to anchor yourself to the now. The now is already holding everything. Nothing important slips away when attention relaxes. What remains does so without effort. As the urge to stay aware dissolves, the body follows naturally. Breathing finds its own pace. Sensations soften without instruction. Rest emerges not because the mind has done something correctly, but because it has stopped insisting on doing anything at all. The present does not need to be held. It is stable by nature. And when this is allowed, sleep approaches quietly, not as a transition to be managed, but as a continuation of what is already at ease. Even when the present has softened, the mind may continue one last habit. It looks for meaning. It asks, often without words, whether this moment has value, whether the day has led somewhere, whether time has been used well enough to justify rest. The Stoics recognize this tendency as one of the mind's most persistent efforts, not the desire to act, but the desire to evaluate. During the day, meaning is often tied to outcome. Time feels worthwhile when it produces something, a decision, a result, a visible direction. But night stands outside this logic. There is no measure here, no standard by which time must prove itself. The hours of the night do not exist to be interpreted. They are not symbols, they are not opportunities. They pass without intention, and this is precisely what allows rest to take place. The Stoics understood that meaning is not something time carries by default. It is something the mind assigns when it believes order depends on explanation. But order does not require interpretation to exist. Time does not become empty when it is no longer examined. It becomes neutral. In this neutrality, the pressure to justify the day begins to dissolve. Nothing needs to be concluded. Nothing needs to add up to anything more than what it already is. The mind often resists this at first. It fears that releasing meaning will lead to confusion or loss. But the Stoics saw that the opposite is true. When meaning is set aside, clarity increases. The mind no longer circles around questions that have no function at night. There is no lesson to extract here. No narrative to complete before rest is allowed. Time has already done its part. As this recognition settles, the hours feel wider. They are no longer counted or weighed. The night becomes a space rather than a sequence, a space where nothing needs to signify anything else. And in this space, rest appears naturally, not as a reward, not as an escape, but as a state that arises when time is finally allowed to be exactly what it is. As meaning loosens its hold, another assumption often remains quietly in place. The sense that the day is still present. Even in rest, the mind may behave as if today has not fully ended. It keeps fragments of it nearby, unfinished impressions, emotional residue, a subtle awareness of what has been lived. The Stoics paid close attention to this transition. They understood that a day does not end when the sun sets, but when attention releases its claim over it. The day has already completed itself. Everything that could occur within it has already occurred. Nothing from it requires further participation, and yet the mind often treats the day as if it must be carried forward, as though letting it go would mean losing something important. This is not because the day contains danger. It is because the mind confuses continuity with responsibility. The Stoics made a careful distinction here. To experience something does not mean to remain accountable for it indefinitely. A day does not need supervision once it has passed. Night introduces a different order, one where sequence no longer governs experience. one where moments are no longer connected by obligation. In this order, the day has no place to follow. It remains where it belongs, complete, contained, and settled. When this is allowed, the mind stops checking itself. It no longer monitors the distance between now and what came before. There is no need to keep today intact. Nothing valuable depends on this preservation. The Stoics understood that release is not forgetting. It is proper placement. What belongs to action stays with action. What belongs to rest remains untouched. As this separation becomes clear, the body responds naturally. Muscles soften without instruction. Breath deepens without guidance. The sense of today fades, not suddenly, but steadily, like a shoreline disappearing into fog. There is no loss in this fading, only relief. The night does not ask you to bring the day with you. It does not require review, closure, or understanding. It offers a pause without continuity. And as the mind accepts that the day cannot cross this threshold, rest unfolds gently, free from repetition, free from obligation, free from the quiet belief that something must still be held. As the day releases its hold, the mind may still carry one final assumption about time, that it builds up, that hours stack upon one another, forming a weight that must be carried forward, that what has passed adds pressure to what comes next. The Stoics questioned this belief quietly but firmly. They understood that time does not gather. It does not pile up behind the present moment. Only impressions accumulate. The mind often confuses memory with substance. It treats past hours as if they remain active, pressing against the present. But time itself leaves no residue. Each moment arrives empty. Each moment departs without leaving a trace. The sense of accumulation comes from attention that has not yet released its grip. At night, this misunderstanding becomes more visible. There is no continuity of effort here, no task that requires yesterday's weight. The body does not feel heavier because of the hours already lived. It responds only to what is present now. The Stoics understood that fatigue does not come from time passing, but from the belief that what has passed must still be carried. When this belief softens, the night feels lighter, not because anything has been removed, but because nothing unnecessary is being held. There is no pile of moments waiting to be processed, no backlog of experience. What happened earlier does not lean into the now. It remains where it occurred. The mind may resist this at first. It is accustomed to continuity, to cause and consequence. But rest exists outside this structure. In rest there is no accumulation, only presence. The Stoics saw this as a form of freedom, to meet each moment without inherited weight. As this recognition settles, the sense of duration fades. Time is no longer something that extends. It becomes a series of gentle arrivals and departures, each complete in itself. And in this understanding, rest deepens. Not because the night has erased anything, but because it has revealed a simple truth. Nothing is building up. Nothing is waiting to be resolved. The moment stands alone, light, unburdened, and sufficient for sleep. Even when time no longer accumulates, the mind may still feel a quiet urgency, not tied to a specific task, not connected to any clear obligation, but present as a subtle pressure, the sense that something should already be done. The Stoics understood this feeling well. They recognized it as the habit of living under deadlines, even when no deadline exists. During the day, time is structured by limits. There are moments when action must occur, decisions that must be made before opportunity passes. This creates a rhythm of urgency that serves a purpose, but night dissolves this structure. There is no window closing here, no advantage gained by speed, no consequence attached to delay. And yet, the mind often continues as if a clock were still watching. It imagines an invisible cutoff, a point beyond which rest might no longer be deserved, or clarity might be lost. The Stoics saw this as a misunderstanding of time's nature. Deadlines belong to action, not to existence. The night does not operate on completion. Nothing here expires. There is no correct moment to fall asleep, no measure of progress being tracked, no expectation that must be met before rest is allowed. Time is not evaluating you. When this becomes clear, urgency loosens its grip. The body no longer feels late. The mind no longer searches for permission. The Stoics believed that peace arises when effort aligns with reality. And in the night, reality contains no deadlines. There is nowhere to arrive before something ends. Nothing important is about to be missed. The mind may test this idea quietly, checking for consequences, waiting for discomfort. But none appears. Without a deadline, moments widen. They are no longer approached with caution or haste. They are simply entered. Breathing slows, not because it has been guided, but because it is no longer responding to pressure. The sense of time shifts again, from something that must be used correctly to something that simply passes. And in this passing, rest deepens. Sleep does not happen on time. It happens when urgency ends. The night offers no finish line, no requirement to cross anything before stopping. It is open. It is patient. And within this openness, the mind finally understands that nothing is late, nothing is behind, and nothing is waiting on the other side of this moment. Even when deadlines dissolve, the mind may still hold on to one final posture: trust. A quiet belief that time must behave correctly, that it should pass in a certain way. That rest depends on its cooperation. The Stoics noticed this subtle expectation. They saw how easily the mind turns time into a partner that must be relied upon or feared. During the day, this makes sense. Time governs movement, consequence, and coordination. It matters when things happen, but night removes the conditions that make trust relevant. Nothing here depends on timing. Nothing improves if time flows faster or slower. Nothing is endangered by delay. And yet the mind may still watch time carefully, as if waiting to see whether it will allow rest to arrive. This vigilance creates tension. The Stoics understood that peace does not come from trusting time, but from stepping out of negotiation with it altogether. Time is not an agent. It does not decide. It does not cooperate or resist. It passes. To trust time implies expectation. Expectation implies investment. At night, there is no return on this investment. The mind often believes that if it relaxes too fully, time might slip away incorrectly, that something essential might not happen. But nothing essential belongs to this moment. Sleep is not granted by time. It is not scheduled or approved. It arises when resistance ends. The Stoics saw that struggle often comes from misplaced trust, from asking something neutral to deliver reassurance. Time offers no reassurance, and it does not need to. When the mind stops asking time to behave, attention releases its grip. There is no longer a need to monitor the passing minutes. No need to sense whether the night is progressing as it should. Moments are no longer evaluated. They come and go without commentary. This does not create emptiness. It creates ease. The body responds first. Muscles soften when nothing is being anticipated. Breath slows when it is no longer waiting for a signal. The mind follows, not because it has decided to trust time, but because it has stopped relating to it at all. Time becomes background rather than structure, a quiet movement that requires no opinion. And in this neutrality, rest deepens. There is no need to believe in time tonight, no need to rely on it for anything. It will pass, as it always does, and sleep will arrive, not because time allowed it, but because nothing remained that needed to be watched. Even when trust in time has loosened, the mind may still carry a final, almost invisible assumption, the sense of being observed, not by another person, not by an external force, but by time itself. A quiet feeling that moments are being counted, that progress is being noted, that rest is occurring under some form of evaluation. The Stoics were keenly aware of this illusion. They understood how easily the mind turns neutral processes into witnesses. During waking life, observation matters. Actions are seen, consequences follow. Time appears to record what happens within it. But night removes the stage. There is no performance here, no role to maintain, no outcome depending on appearance. Time does not look back at you. It does not measure how quickly you relax. It does not notice whether sleep arrives early or late. This idea of being watched is not imposed from outside. It is a habit formed through repetition. The mind learns to monitor itself because it believes something important depends on correct timing, but nothing in the night depends on correctness. The Stoics saw that self-observation often continues long after it has lost its purpose. Attention keeps turning inward, checking whether rest is happening properly. This creates tension. As long as something is being monitored, it cannot fully settle. When the assumption of observation dissolves, awareness changes its quality. It no longer turns back on itself. It spreads outward, then softens. There is no audience to satisfy, no internal record being kept. The body senses this first. Muscles release when they are no longer being evaluated. Breathing deepens when it is no longer noticed. Nothing is highlighted, nothing is tracked. Moments pass without identity. This anonymity is not emptiness, it is safety. There is nothing to live up to, nothing to get right. Time is not a mirror. It does not reflect your state back to you. It moves on, indifferent and complete. And in this indifference, the mind finally feels free to rest, unseen, unmeasured, and entirely at ease. Even after the feeling of being watched fades, the mind may still hold on to a quieter belief. That time is waiting for something from you, not urgently, not explicitly, but as a background assumption that the passing hours expect a certain state, a certain readiness, a certain outcome. The Stoics were attentive to this subtle pressure. They saw how easily the mind assigns expectation to what is neutral. During the day, this expectation has a function. Time is structured around purpose. Moments are linked to tasks, decisions, responsibilities. In that context, it can feel natural to believe that time is owed something in return: attention, effort, progress. But night exists outside this exchange. Time does not demand participation here. It does not wait for insight, resolution, or improvement. It does not expect the mind to arrive at a particular place before it continues. The Stoics understood that this sense of obligation is learned, not inherent. It develops through repetition, through days spent aligning oneself with schedules, goals, and outcomes. When the night arrives, these conditions dissolve, but the habit of expectation may remain. The mind may continue to prepare itself as if something will be required at any moment. This preparation creates restlessness. As long as something is expected, the mind stays partially alert, holding itself in reserve. But time is not waiting for you to change. It is not paused until rest is achieved. It moves without reference to your state. When this is understood, something softens. There is no standard to meet, no readiness to achieve, no inner signal that must be produced before rest is allowed. The Stoics believed that freedom appears when obligation is placed where it belongs. Action carries expectation. Rest does not. At night, nothing is being asked of you, not by the day that has passed, not by the hours that are unfolding. The body responds naturally to this release. Tension drains when there is nothing left to prepare for. Breathing deepens when it is no longer anticipatory. The mind follows gradually. Thoughts lose their forward lean. They no longer gather themselves for response. Time continues, indifferent and complete. It neither waits nor urges. And in this neutrality, rest becomes possible, not because something has been fulfilled, but because nothing was required in the first place. Even when expectation dissolves, the mind may still hold on to a familiar standard, the idea that time must be used well, that hours have value only when they are spent correctly, that rest itself should be efficient, productive or restorative in a measurable way. The Stoics recognized this impulse as one of the most persistent habits of the mind. They saw how easily usefulness becomes a moral lens, how time is judged rather than experienced. During the day, this judgment often feels necessary. Time is shaped by intention. Actions are weighed by outcome. Effort is evaluated by result. But night stands outside this framework. There is nothing here that benefits from being optimized, no advantage gained by resting correctly, no improvement achieved by using time wisely. The hours of the night do not ask to be justified. The Stoics understood that usefulness belongs to action, not to being, and at night being is enough. The mind may resist this idea quietly. It may attempt to turn rest into a task, monitoring its depth, its quality, its effectiveness. But this effort undermines the very thing it seeks. As long as time is being used, the mind remains engaged. Rest appears only when time is allowed to pass without purpose. There is no better or worse way for the night to unfold, no correct pace for sleep to arrive, no ideal use of these hours. Time does not improve when it is managed. It simply moves. The Stoics believed that peace comes when evaluation is released at the appropriate moment. Night is that moment. When the mind stops assigning value to how time is spent, attention loosens its grip. There is no internal accounting, no silent review of whether the night is going well enough. Moments no longer need to earn their place. The body senses this immediately. Breathing becomes less deliberate. Muscles soften when there is no goal attached to rest. Thoughts may still appear, but they no longer organize themselves around improvement. Time becomes neutral again, neither wasted nor fulfilled, just present. And in this neutrality, sleep approaches naturally. Not because the night has been used wisely, but because it has been allowed to exist without judgment, without expectation, and without the quiet demand to be anything more than what it already is. Even after usefulness is released, the mind may still search for one final gesture, closure, a sense that the day, the thoughts, or the passing hours must be completed properly, that something should feel finished before rest can truly begin. The Stoics were careful observers of this impulse. They noticed how often the mind confuses order with completion and completion with safety. During the day, closure has a role. Actions begin and end. Decisions are concluded. Effort moves toward resolution. But night does not belong to this rhythm. There is no task here that requires an ending, no sequence waiting for a final step, no story that must be tied together before sleep is permitted. Time does not arrive at night in fragments that need to be closed. It arrives whole. The mind, however, often carries the habit of finishing forward. It reviews what remains open. It searches for loose ends, emotional, mental, narrative. This search creates tension. As long as something feels unfinished, the mind stays slightly awake, holding itself near the surface. The Stoics understood that many things do not close because they were never meant to. Not every experience resolves. Not every thought reaches a conclusion. And this is not a failure. Closure is a tool of action, not a requirement of rest. At night, time does not ask to be wrapped up. It does not need a summary or a final understanding. When the mind allows this, the pressure to resolve begins to fade. Thoughts may still appear, but they no longer insist on being completed. They pass without destination. The Stoics believed that peace emerges when the mind stops demanding symmetry from experience. Life does not always form clean shapes. Time does not always end where it began. And in the night, this irregularity is not only acceptable, it is protective. Nothing important is harmed by remaining open until morning. Nothing essential depends on resolution now. The body responds to this release of demand. Muscles soften when there is nothing left to conclude. Breath deepens when it is no longer waiting for an ending. The mind follows gradually, not by deciding to stop, but by recognizing that stopping is not required. Time continues without closure, smooth, uninterrupted, and sufficient. And within this continuity, rest becomes possible. Not because everything has been finished, but because nothing needed to be finished at all. Even when closure is released, the mind may still hold one deeply rooted assumption, that time is yours, that it belongs to you in some personal way, that it can be owned, lost, protected, or wasted, that it carries a private claim. The Stoics were careful to question this belief. They saw how strongly the idea of ownership binds the mind to tension. From this perspective, rest can feel risky, as if time is slipping away unguarded, as if something that belongs to you is being mishandled. But night quietly removes this illusion. Time does not arrive with your name on it. It does not wait for your permission. It does not adjust itself according to your plans. The Stoics understood that time is not a possession. It is a condition. It is something you move within, not something you hold. When this distinction becomes clear, a great deal of pressure dissolves. If time does not belong to you, it cannot be lost by resting. It cannot be misused by stopping. There is nothing to protect. The mind often resists this idea. Ownership provides a sense of agency. Letting go of it can feel like surrender. But the Stoics saw surrender here not as weakness, but as alignment. Time does not need to be managed personally. It moves whether you intervene or not. At night, this movement becomes especially evident. Hours pass without request. Moments unfold without reference to intention. Nothing is taken from you when sleep arrives. Nothing is given back when you wake. Time remains unchanged. When the mind releases the belief of ownership, attention softens. There is no longer a need to hold on to moments or to account for how they pass. The body responds naturally to this release. Breathing steadies when there is nothing to guard. Muscles loosen when there is nothing at stake. Thoughts slow, not because they are controlled, but because they are no longer protecting a claim. The Stoics believed that peace appears when the mind stops treating existence as property. Time does not belong to you, and because of this, you are free to rest within it. Nothing is being lost. Nothing is slipping away unseen. The night continues, open, neutral, and sufficient, carrying you gently without asking anything in return. Even when ownership releases its grip, the mind may still hold on to a quieter impulse, the urge to remember, a subtle sense that time must be held in memory to have mattered, that moments lose value if they are not retained, marked, or carried forward. The Stoics were attentive to this impulse as well. They understood how easily memory becomes a form of attachment, not to the past itself, but to the idea that experience must be preserved. During the day, remembering feels necessary. Information is stored, events are recalled, lessons are extracted and carried onward. Memory supports continuity, but night does not depend on continuity. There is nothing here that needs to be stored for later use. No insight that must be kept alive, no experience that becomes fragile if it fades. Time does not require witnesses to remain complete. The mind often believes that if a moment is not remembered, it disappears improperly, as if forgetting were a kind of failure. But the Stoics saw forgetting differently. They understood it as a natural function of rest. Not everything needs to be carried forward. Some moments exist only to pass. At night, time does not ask to be archived. It does not ask to be recalled tomorrow. Memory has its place. Night is not that place. As the urge to remember softens, experience becomes lighter. Moments no longer carry the pressure of significance. They are free to exist briefly, then release themselves. The body responds naturally to this shift. Breathing becomes less deliberate. Sensations fade without resistance. Thoughts lose their need to form impressions. They appear, then pass, without leaving marks. Time continues, complete without record. Nothing essential is lost when the night is forgotten. Nothing important depends on recall. The Stoics understood that rest deepens when experience is allowed to leave no trace. Time does not need to be remembered to be sufficient. It does not require memory to justify its passing. And in this quiet anonymity, the mind finally releases its hold, allowing sleep to arrive without imprint, without retention, and without the need to take anything with it into the morning. Even when the need to remember softens, the mind may still hold on to another assumption. That time leaves marks, that it imprints itself on the mind and body in ways that must be noticed, interpreted, or carried. That each passing hour leaves behind a trace that accumulates quietly, shaping what comes next. The Stoics observed this belief with care. They understood how easily the mind turns experience into evidence, proof that something has changed, that something has been added, that something now weighs more than before. During the day, this way of thinking feels natural. Effort leaves fatigue. Events leave impressions. Time appears to carve its path through experience. But night does not work this way. The hours of rest do not engrave themselves. They do not leave signs that must be read later. They pass without marking. The Stoics understood that most marks are created not by time, but by resistance to it. When the mind holds tightly to experience, it presses moments into itself, leaving grooves that feel permanent. But when attention relaxes, time moves through without friction. At night, there is no surface that needs to be shaped, no record that must be written. The mind may still search for signs, asking whether rest is deep enough, whether the body is changing as it should. This searching recreates the illusion of marks. But nothing here needs to be measured. Nothing here needs to leave proof of having passed. The Stoics believed that rest restores not by adding anything, but by allowing impressions to dissolve. Time does not improve the mind by engraving lessons into it. It restores by passing gently, without insistence. When this is allowed, the sense of accumulation fades even further. The body feels lighter, not because something has been removed, but because nothing is being pressed into it. Breathing smooths out when it is no longer monitored for effect. Muscles soften when there is no expectation of change. Thoughts lose their edge. They no longer seek to register themselves. Time flows without friction, leaving no residue behind. The Stoics understood that this unmarked passing is what allows true renewal. What leaves no trace does not need to be repaired. What leaves no mark does not need recovery. The night offers this kind of passage. Nothing is being carved into you now. Nothing is being added or taken away. Time moves through quietly, touching without imprint, and in this gentle movement the mind is finally free to rest, not shaped, not altered, but held in a state where nothing needs to remain once the moment has passed. Even when time is allowed to pass without leaving marks, the mind may still hold one final habit: the need to witness, a quiet assumption that something must be observed in order to be real, that moments require attention to exist fully. That rest, too, must be noticed in order to count. The Stoics were aware of this tendency. They saw how often the mind appoints itself as a witness, as if experience were incomplete without observation. During the day, witnessing has purpose. Attention tracks events. Awareness guides action. Being present allows choice. But night removes the need for this role. Nothing here depends on being seen. Nothing requires acknowledgement. Nothing improves through observation. Time does not need an audience. The mind may still hover nearby, watching the body soften, monitoring the descent into rest. This watching feels subtle, almost protective, but it keeps the mind slightly engaged, never fully releasing its position. The Stoics understood that peace does not arrive while something remains on watch. As long as experience is being witnessed, it remains slightly external, slightly managed. But rest unfolds best when there is no one left to notice it. Time passes whether it is observed or not. Sleep arrives whether it is anticipated or ignored. There is no loss when attention steps aside. The mind often fears that without witnessing, something essential will be missed. But nothing essential belongs to the night. No insight needs to be captured. No moment needs to be held. The Stoics believed that freedom appears when the mind releases its position as observer, not by force, not by command, but by recognizing that observation has no task here. When witnessing softens, awareness changes its shape. It no longer points at anything. It spreads, then thins, then fades. The body responds immediately. Breath becomes quieter when it is no longer noticed. Sensations dissolve when they are no longer named. Thoughts slow, not because they are stopped, but because there is no one left to follow them. Time continues, unseen and unaffected. Nothing is lost in this invisibility. Nothing requires record. The night does not ask to be noticed. It does not require confirmation. It simply unfolds. And as the mind releases its role as witness, rest deepens naturally, not as an event to be observed, but as a condition that exists when nothing remains that needs to watch. Even when the role of witness dissolves, the mind may still hold on to a quieter concern. The question of how rest should happen, a subtle monitoring of posture, breath, depth, timing, an assumption that rest has a correct form, that there is a right way to soften, a proper way to let go. The Stoics recognized this impulse as another extension of control, not control over action, but control over release. During the day, form matters. Movements are adjusted, responses are refined. Precision serves purpose, but night removes the need for precision. Time does not care how rest unfolds. It does not favor stillness over movement, silence over thought, sleep over quiet wakefulness. Nothing here is graded. The mind often resists this neutrality. It looks for signals, signs that rest is happening correctly, that the body is responding as it should. This searching creates tension. As long as rest is being evaluated, it remains incomplete. The Stoics understood that rest is not an achievement. It is not produced through technique. It emerges when interference ends. Time does not respond to effort here. It does not reward better methods or punish imperfect ones. Whether the mind drifts or lingers, whether sleep comes quickly or slowly, time passes unchanged. There is no preferred outcome. The belief that rest must take a certain shape keeps attention lightly engaged, holding the mind just above the surface. When this belief softens, rest is allowed to find its own form. The body responds first. Breathing adjusts without direction. Muscles release without instruction. Sensations rearrange themselves naturally. The mind follows more slowly. Thoughts lose their structure. They no longer aim toward quiet or resolution. They simply appear, then fade. Time continues, indifferent to the quality of rest. It does not notice whether the night is deep or shallow. It does not track progress. The Stoics believed that peace appears when effort withdraws from places where it has no function. Night is such a place. There is no correct way to rest within it. No pattern that must be followed. No state that must be achieved. Time does not care how you rest, because rest is not a transaction. Nothing is being evaluated. Nothing is being improved. The night moves on, open and impartial. And within this indifference, the mind finally releases its concern, allowing rest to arrive in whatever form it chooses, without correction, without guidance, and without the quiet pressure to become something specific. Even when rest is allowed to take its own form, the mind may still hold on to a final concern, the fear of being held back, a quiet belief that time might delay something important, that resting now could interfere with what comes next, that pausing might slow progress or create distance from the future. The Stoics were attentive to this belief. They understood how deeply the mind associates movement with advancement and stillness with loss. During the day, this association has meaning. Action creates momentum. Timing affects outcome. Delays can carry consequence. But night does not participate in this logic. Nothing that belongs to the future is obstructed by rest. Nothing important is postponed by stopping. The Stoics saw that time does not function as a barrier. It does not block paths or restrict movement. It simply passes. The sense of being held back comes from resistance, from the mind's effort to stay oriented toward what is not present. When attention remains forward-facing, rest feels like interruption. But when orientation softens, Stillness no longer feels like delay. There is nowhere to fall behind in the night, no sequence being measured, no progress being tracked. Time is not comparing where you are now to where you should be next. The mind may still test this idea. It may check for urgency, listening for a signal that it should remain alert, but none arrives. Nothing is waiting impatiently. Nothing is closing its window. The Stoics believed that true alignment appears when effort matches the nature of the moment. Night does not require advancement. It requires release. When this is understood, the fear of delay dissolves. Rest no longer feels like something that steals time. It becomes something that exists alongside it. The body responds naturally to this shift. Muscles loosen when there is no need to prepare for movement. Breathing slows when it is no longer oriented toward readiness. Thoughts lose their urgency. They no longer gather themselves around what comes next. Time continues, unimpeded and neutral. It does not move faster when you are active, nor slower when you are still. Nothing is being postponed by rest. Nothing is being endangered. The Stoics understood that peace comes when the mind stops framing stillness as loss. Time does not hold you back. It does not restrain or delay. It moves on, carrying everything with it, including rest. And in this understanding, the mind finally allows itself to stop, not because it has caught up, but because there is nothing it was ever falling behind from. At the end of all these softenings, one final idea remains. That time somehow depends on you, that it needs your attention to continue, your awareness to remain intact, your participation to move forward correctly. The Stoics questioned this assumption at its root. They understood how easily the mind places itself at the center of processes that do not require it. During the day, involvement feels necessary. Time is filled with action, response, correction. The sense of participation gives structure to experience. But night reveals something quieter. Time moves without assistance. It does not pause when attention fades. It does not falter when the mind grows quiet. It does not require supervision to continue unfolding. The belief that time needs you is subtle, but it keeps the mind lightly engaged, holding itself ready just in case. Ready to notice, ready to respond, ready to intervene. The Stoics understood that this readiness, when unnecessary, becomes strain. At night, nothing needs to be held together, nothing requires management. Time does not rely on your clarity. It does not ask for your understanding. It continues whether you are awake or asleep, whether you are present or absent. When this is fully accepted, a deep release becomes possible. The mind no longer needs to stay nearby. It no longer needs to accompany the passing hours. There is no responsibility to remain conscious, no obligation to witness or maintain continuity. The body senses this immediately. Muscles release when there is nothing left to support. Breathing becomes effortless when it is no longer tied to awareness. Thoughts thin out, not because they are stopped, but because they are no longer needed. Time moves on, complete in itself. Nothing collapses when you let go. Nothing disappears when attention withdraws. The Stoics believed that true rest begins when the mind understands it is not required, not needed to guide, not needed to preserve, not needed to ensure that anything continues. Time does not need you to pass, and because of this, you are free to leave it alone, free to rest without participation, free to sleep without involvement. The night carries itself. And in this quiet recognition, the mind finally steps aside, not into darkness but into a space where nothing depends on it. a space where rest arrives naturally, not because it was invited, but because nothing remained that needed to stay awake. Nothing in this series was meant to change time. What softened was the mind's relationship to it. Little by little, the habits fell away, the need to manage, to measure, to trust, to remember, to watch. Not through effort, but through quiet recognition. The Stoics understood that rest does not come from arranging life correctly, but from releasing what was never required. Time was never asking for attention. It was never waiting for readiness or understanding. The pressure came from expectation, from ownership, from the belief that something must be carried forward. When these dissolve, time returns to what it is: neutral, continuous, complete. The night does not ask for resolution. It does not evaluate how rest unfolds. It simply continues. And because it does, the mind no longer needs to follow. Nothing depends on vigilance here. Nothing requires supervision. Rest remains, not as something to achieve, but as what is left when nothing unnecessary stays awake.